Welcome back to our classroom. Today, we have as a guest Dr. Amira Rose Davis, Assistant Professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, the University of Texas, Austin, where she specializes in 20th century American history with an emphasis on race, gender, sports, and politics. Working on her first book, really your second book, right? Because we're talking about the book you co-authored today, but your first solo book, I'll frame it that way.
Okay.
First solo book, Can't Eat a Medal, The Lives and Labors of Black Women Athletes in the Age of Jim Crow. Sounds very interesting. You are also the co-host of the feminist sports podcast, Burn It All Down, and the host of season 3 of American Prodigies. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And I had a chance to dig into the book that you co-authored, Go, Wilma, Go. I was not familiar with this individual and this story, so thank you for sharing something that was new to me and very possibly new to this audience. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. As I mentioned, you co-authored this book with Michael G. Long. Can you talk about your approach? Why is it that you chose to co-author a book and how it is that this came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm gonna take y'all on the journey briefly. So, I have always worked on Black women's sports history, on history of race and sport, and I started to do that in undergraduate. So, I played sports all my life. I thought I was going to college to play sports, and freshman year of college, I plot twist found out that I was pregnant, and
Oh,
it was like all my athletic,
that is a plot
it
twist.
is absolute plot
I
twist.
wasn't ready.
Yeah, you weren't, yeah. And so all of a sudden I was like, what do I do? But I stayed in school, and luckily I had great mentorship there, and they put me onto the Ronald McNair program, which helps people do research of their own design and thinks about grad school. And at that time I wasn't, I was 18. I wasn't really thinking about grad school or anything like that. I didn't even know how one became a professor. But when they asked me what I wanted to do and look into and research, I was like, well, sports, like obviously. And I went to undergrad at Temple University in Philadelphia. And for me, it just felt like as a like aspiring historian, I didn't understand how you could write like the history of Philadelphia without saying like on Mondays after the Eagles win, it's just like a better city, right? Like it just felt like that's how you capture the texture of a city. And at the time, there was very little books in the library about race and sport in the way that I was interested in gender and sport. The scholarship was still developing. And so from the last few years in undergraduate, I started researching about race and sports more. I wrote my McNair thesis on media perceptions of Black male athletes from Jack Johnson to LeBron James. This was the time of LeBron's, King Kong magazine cover.
Right.
Yeah. And so I went directly from undergrad into my PhD program at Johns Hopkins. And once you get there, you have to immediately, it's like getting thrown in the deep end. You have to do like a self-authored article length project. And so I started researching the Negro Leagues, and that took me up to Cooperstown. And there I discovered 3 Black women in the archives who played in the Negro Leagues in the mid-century. And I started writing about them. And I wrote my first article on them. One of them is in that poster behind me, Tony Stone. And from there, I thought I was going to pivot away from writing Black stories about Black women in sports. And my advisor was like, if you don't write it, like who will write this history, and will you like how they write it? And I was like, yeah, probably not. And from that point on, I went looking for Black women's athletic stories and immediately ran into an archival problem. There were some names like Althea Gibson, like Wilma Rudolph, that I was familiar with, that I had known, that I feel like go up in February for Black History Month. But there was very little like full length books about them. But what I did find was a lot of children's books, like
Mm.
huge amounts of children's books, to the point where actually in my larger book, Can't Eat a Medal, write a kind of critique about why Black women's athletic bodies seem to be like perfect stories for children's books. And part of what I say is like in a lot of them, especially that came out in the 90s, in 20 pages, the fact that somebody just on the basis of a dream can overcome racism and sexism
All
felt
right.
like it was a very particular vehicle. And so you fast forward a few years and, I'm working on, I finished my dissertation. I've been a professor for a few years. I've been working on this larger book that looks deeper at Wilma, but also a number of people. We hit the Great Racial Awakening in 2020, and it's also a huge resurgence of athletic activism. And I had been working on the longer history of Black women's athletic activism, and I'd been working with a lot of contemporary athletes about it. And so Michael Long, who is great, and he has historically done a bunch of these kind of children's books with Dr. Uhuru Williams and other historians, where they've taken these stories and they've tried to provide accessible ways to them, but without sacrificing the complexity of Black history in particular. And so Michael approached me and asked me if I would be interested in doing something like that about Wilma. And I was like, me, you know what I write about children's books? Like, I don't know if I'm the one. But it was a really great partnership. And so when we entered into it, I thought about Wilma's story and I thought about the ways her stories have been captured before in children's books. And a few things that I found really important and why I was drawn to the project is a lot of people, if they think of Wilma Rudolph, knows that she had polio and that she didn't walk or run until she was 12. And then, which is wild because she goes to her first Olympics at 15.
Oh,
So a lot of
amazing.
people know that narrative about her, but many people don't know that actually about 18 months before she wins three golds in Rome in 1960, she actually has a baby. And this was something obviously that I really resonated to. And with in thinking about the way that for me personally, teen pregnancy felt like it got invisibilized, or was, seen in this really pathological way. And I didn't realize, once you grow up, nobody, unless they have a calculator, they might not know that you started your family when you were younger. But for me, Yolanda and her presence in Wilma Rudolph's story was really important to not shy away from. And so I entered this book saying, well, I want Yolanda to be a character in this book. I want her daughter to be there, and she is. I also didn't want her to have fully overcome racism and sexism by the end of 20 pages because that's not true. It's not what happened. And so being able to collaborate with somebody like Michael Long and with a press that let us tell a story that didn't necessarily have a great happy ending and had a motivating ending, but it wasn't like we were like, okay, great, she solved racism, she solved sexism, and being able to like be a little more grounded in that felt great. And then the last thing was that I really got to tee off in the author's note, and that was important for me to be able to say, here's further ideas, here's more complexity. I'm gonna throw a bunch of stuff at you. So people who are reading this with younger readers have more context to continue dialogue about this story and the other ways that, the other things that it can touch on.
That's dope. That's dope. That was a mouthful. And I say that in a complimentary way because there's so much that you just shared with us about how this came about, and certainly wouldn't have known any of this unless this question was asked. And there's a lot of things that come to mind for me about what you said, but I don't want to go all over the place. So I'll ask one follow-up question because you live in Texas and I used to live in Texas and now I live in Florida. And you just said you teed off the author's note and you talked about the complexity of the story. You also mentioned that it doesn't necessarily end with the happy ending that a lot of folks are pushing, and a lot of folks within the government, right?
Mhm.
Want they want the happy ending in the history books, but we're living in the now, and there's still no happy ending, right? We're working towards that. What type of reception has your book been getting, especially in places like Texas and Florida and other states that are putting up a lot of resistance for the type of content that we're offering?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because, like, I mean, this is how we have to think about book production, right? So they signed us to do this book in 2020. which was a very different political climate, right? That
Yes.
everybody's forming the DEI committees that they're now disbanding. That's when everybody wanted projects about Black history, and there was a real, energy around that moment, right? And now the book's coming out in an age of banned books, in an age where Black history is under attack, where we've
Just like
had
that.
exactly, like I think there's been something like 500 plus, 600 plus measures that are restricting books about racism, right? And so it's a particular, moment that even changes in 4 years' time. But I do think that there has been a really positive reception, and part of that is because obviously we timed it to come out with the Olympics, and you can get away with a lot during Olympic years. But also because I think in some ways the book is subtle with the lessons in a way that I think really nuanced history can be, which is that it's constantly challenging what it means for Black Americans to be patriotic. It's constantly challenging what it means to race and represent a country that hasn't lived up to its promise to you. One of the things that the book does in the text, for the young readers, is juxtapose the United States' Jim Crow condition with the experiences that one was experiencing in all these other places, which is really subtly, going towards that American exceptionalism and rah-rahness by doing so. But then one of the things that I did in the author's note was being able to say, here's how this also entered Wilma into like a global conversation about anti-Blackness and um, you know, activism and things like that. But I do think that the reception so far has been there's such a hunger for this history. And I do think that in a time where it's being repressed, it only creates, right, more of a hunger for what is kind of being held at bay. And so luckily, Austin is a kind of bubble in and of itself. But so
Right.
like local libraries, things like that. We just had a really great event down at the Carver with a woman, Heather Terry, who did a puppet show about Wilma.
I
And we
love the
had
Carver.
yeah, and so like that was a really great reception, right? And we're seeing it kind of nationally get really good reception as well. And I do think, and for me, this is why I study sports, right? Is I do think that there's a way that sports allows access for conversations that slip past people's guard, right? And I know this historically, like when we're thinking about one of the things Wilma Rudolph did after moments in this book is the State Department actually used her to do foreign policy because countries were welcoming to athletes. They wanted to build up their athletics. And
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
so I think that it's very
I'm
similar.
so, and this is not necessarily a great comparison, but it makes me think about Dennis Rodman
Exactly.
when he was brought out to North Korea.
No, no, but exactly, right? Like there's a way that their sports is seen as an apolitical space. We know it's anything but. Part of what my work and a lot of work of scholars who do critical sports studies show is sports is like a very inherently political space. It's extremely political. There's a lot of stuff that gets run through sports, both formally and informally. But because it has this idea about it, that it's apolitical, that it's a meritocracy, all this stuff, it means that you have this kind of platform to stand on when you're talking about things that sometimes would otherwise be checked, right? And so I do think that so far that has insulated this project, although we were kind of like, this is an interesting moment for it to be coming out.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great moment. You lucked out. You lucked out. I'm gonna push back a little bit.
Yeah, go for
Respectfully, I didn't when I read the book,
it. Mhm.
I didn't receive it as subtle as you're framing it.
Okay.
And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
I was reading and I was like, oh, okay. Oh, we going hard around here. That's how I read it.
I receive it. I like that. I like that. I always think
And
things are more subtle than they are.
yeah, I didn't think it was subtle. That's not the word that came to mind at all. And maybe it's because I read a lot of children's books. I
Mm,
interview a lot of people. The publishing company send us a ton of books every week. And so I have great comparative basis. And I can't necessarily I think there's definitely other authors who are framing things and getting into the complexities and pushing messages centered around justice and resistance, so on and so forth. But I will say that I read your book and I didn't feel like y'all were holding back any punches.
Well,
But
I
I
appreciate,
appreciate
yeah,
you know what I'm saying? I read, I'm like, yeah, all right, you know, we're gonna talk about it. Let's talk about it.
right.
And there's space for different approaches, right?
Yeah,
So I'm not saying this with any shade to anybody else or how they approach things. We got to have different approaches so that we can at least initiate the conversation.
for sure.
Well, but I think y'all were doing much more than initiating the conversation. Y'all
Yeah.
definitely were
Well, I
pushing.
appreciate that because, we try, and I think for me, a little bit of it is like a genre thing, right? Is that for me, I think it reads a little more subtle because there's ways where if I was writing in my monograph, it would have been a little bit of a harder punch, right? But I can see relative to the genre where it, lands a little bit different for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, you talked about earlier the stuff that you came across in which they frame these stories with the bow tie at the end, right? With the happy ending where racism is over type stuff.
Yeah.
And the, this that feels so inauthentic to me. So when I but it's coming. It is coming. And I get the approach, right? It's easier to move units if you have a happy ending. It's like movies, right?
Right.
The the movie, especially if it's a family movie, kids movie, it's gotta have a happy ending. Sometimes I watch movies with my wife and I'm just like, yeah, this is whack
Right.
because it has a happy ending. And I'm like,
My husband's like that. Like every time there's like a huge battle, there's tension. He's like, they should have cut the movie there. We don't need the last 15 minutes. And I'm always like, some people want resolution.
nah, I'm gonna have to watch some movies with your husband. I think we would be good movie watching buddies. Give me the real stuff. And so I felt like you and Michael G. Long gave the audience the real stuff. And I appreciate that because we need to embrace not just the reality of our history as a country.
But
We
other
have to we have to confront it. And uh, for our young people, you know, us putting the happy ending in the book doesn't change what they are experiencing in the now.
absolutely. And
And
I think it
so,
also makes it harder to see themselves in the continuum of the long kind of struggle for freedom, right? And I think about this a lot with like how we teach. I mean, I'm just finishing up a summer course right now, Intro to African American History, and we're doing the Civil Rights Movement. And the my whole unit about the Civil Rights Movement is about how we think about it, how we teach it, how we remember it, how it's captured in movies, how it's captured on TV, et cetera, et cetera. And even the built environment, what streets are named for Martin, what streets are named for Malcolm. Like, here are these messages that we are receiving. Let's talk about why, about history. It's the political uses of the past. It's the production of what history is, right? That's not a political act either. And for me, I think my problem with books that do, and to be clear, this is a long tradition of Black history because it had to be in the mid-century. You had to write in an uplifting way. It was also about being encouraging, right? And I think over the decades, people have found a way to balance that with something that's empowering and also, that feels more authentic. And I think about this a lot. I was just teaching Ruby Bridges, and Ruby Bridges 6 months ago was promoting her new book on the Colbert Show. And first of all, the past is not past because here's Ruby Bridges looking like she's 40 years old and doing this. But the wild thing to watch her talking about her book and having a very similar conversation where books about Ruby Bridges used to be like the February book, like the Black history book, right? And now she has a book that is being banned along with these other books on the basis of it making children uncomfortable. The invisible word there, of course, is white. But I can't imagine saying to Ruby Bridges, who at 6 years old integrated a school in New Orleans where she spent an entire year going to school alone because so many people had a racist reaction to pull their kids out of the school. And you're telling that 6 year old who had to be escorted into the school that somebody's uncomfortable about learning about that. It's wild to me, right? And but
Wild.
I think that I think about that tension and the complexity and how those books that I had in the 90s about Ruby Bridges tell her story in a way with a bow tie. And I think about me as a millennial thinking about Ruby Bridges, and the way that I encountered her story was she did this and now this has all changed. And that shuts down our conversations now about how schools are more segregated now than comparable to the civil rights era, right, to the classical civil rights era. How that segregation, right, may not be written under Jim Crow laws, but is still absolutely being produced. About how things like book banning fit into this longer history, and you miss that if you think the case is closed and the bow is tied. And so I really think that that ability to keep stories going while providing something to hold on to, right?
Mm.
And that's what we tried to do. That, like, you want to get to the end of the book and feel like you still can hold on to something. And I don't want, like, I have three kids. Like, I didn't want any of them, or the youngest really, to walk away without feeling like they could grasp onto a message that they felt they could do something with. And so I think that's always the balance.
Mm. Yeah. Wow, wow, that's real. Um, yes, it's fascinating the twists and turns of our society, the things that we're experiencing now, and how far we travel only to then travel back.
Right.
And talking about traveling back, wondering if you could discuss the societal conditions of Clarksville, Tennessee during Wilma's childhood, and how they influenced her activism. I know a little bit about Clarksville, but I probably learned some more just by reading your book.
For sure. So Clarksville, Tennessee, which is about 45 minutes outside of Nashville, really looks similar to a lot of towns in the Jim Crow South, even in the Up South. So Tennessee is considered Up South, right? It's not the Delta, it's not
Right,
Mississippi, it's
right.
not Alabama, but it's still got some stuff going on. And Clarksville, Tennessee has a robust, right, Black community life in it. So you have segregation, but one of the things I really stress is that under the color line, under segregation, under Jim Crow, Black people found a way to support their institutions, to have schools, to have fraternities and sororities and bands, and to build hospitals and et cetera, like that. And so Black Clarksville absolutely did that, right? But there was still very much segregation in terms of public accommodations. These were huge, so access to public spaces. And public transportation, things like that. One of the things I think is significant is that Wilma Rudolph, as somebody with polio, they lived close enough to Nashville, which is really important because Meharry Medical is in Nashville, and that was the place where Black doctors and nurses and medical professionals were trained for, I mean, still, it was for so long like one of the only places, right, that Black folks could get medical education, that it was really the epicenter of Black medical professionals. And that being 45 minutes away was really a blessing for the Rudolphs because it meant that Wilma could go and actually access care. Right. Now it meant that she had to take a grueling 45-minute journey on the back of a segregated bus into Nashville, but Black Nashville was connected, right? So like you have these cities in the Jim Crow South that become hubs to these more rural spaces.
Mm.
And segregation is flourishing throughout it, but then within these central hubs, you have a really robust Black kind of institutional presence, which is what Meharry was. You also, it wasn't uncommon for towns like Clarksville to celebrate Black folks from their town when it convenienced them. But I think like the big thing you see in this book, in this moment with Wilma, is that they fully intended that celebration to still be segregated, right? They wanted to lay claim to her symbolically, but like not actually, right? And so that was something you saw common because at the same time that you have Jim Crow hardening across the country, you also have a real rise of Black popular culture, of music, of jazz, of blues, of art and poetry and literature. And so I think from really the 20s and the 30s where you start really seeing that explosion. There's always a tension that's going to exist between Black performers, and I'm including athletes in that, as both a sport, a labor, and an art form. I was doing a lot of work. But you have that tension between the symbolic value of Black artistic work and labor and things like that with the kind of real lived conditions. And so Clarksville fits right into that kind of history of what the 1950s, what the 1960s looked like.
Mm. Well, thank you. Thank you for that background. Yeah, you know, it makes me think about the the moments in which I see some of our great Black athletes today get treated, in which, you know, they're loved when they're winning championships and things of the sort. But as soon as they start utilizing their platforms to speak on societal issues, whether we're talking about racism or other relevant issues, then there's a lot of backlash from their so-called followers. Um, because as you mentioned earlier, a lot of folks think that sports are apolitical, and they're not. We know that. Um, Talk to me about some highlights from the book. So, for example, what Wilma's decision to demand an integrated celebration in her honor, which I absolutely love because she put them in a bind. She put them in a bind. You're gonna celebrate me. You go out to celebrate all of me,
Absolutely.
right? And so there ain't no celebration taking place if my people can't partake.
Right.
Talk to me about that. Like, why was this such a pivotal moment in her journey as an activist?
Absolutely. I think that you know, to have all this fanfare when you're coming home, right? She was at the White House, met the president, you know, all this stuff is happening. You hear a town that, of course, you have a very tense relationship with trying to celebrate you. And I think having the wherewithal to say, as I mean, young still, right? Like, you know, we're talking about somebody in their early 20s, like 20.
Mm.
Um,
It took a lot of courage.
Right. But being able to understand leverage in that moment and to say, no, this, I'm not coming to this event unless it's integrated, unless, you know, it's everybody, because I'm not going to have my folks be siloed, is like a really powerful thing, right? And there's other athletes that come back. I work with Wyoming Tyus in Georgia. She comes back 4 years later in 64, and in Georgia they do a segregated parade, right? Which they don't say they're doing it, but she notices while she's on the parade that it's only going through the Black neighborhoods, right? But for Wilma to take that moment and to recognize that position and to kind of stand her ground is very significant, right? And she does this rhetorically a number of times. Like even when my other favorite moment that we do depict in the book is a direct quote from her that we include in the text when a reporter asks her, you know, how she's feeling, and she's like, in America, I'm pushed to the back. Like here, I'm pushed to the front, right? And one of the things that is so powerful about Wilma's contrasting images of her experience as a Black athlete abroad and her experience as a Black citizen in the United States, is she's literally being guarded at points by dogs, right? While college students her age in Nashville, Tennessee are having dogs set on them, right? For sitting in at a lunch counter, for asking the right to vote,
Mm.
right? And so there's a way that she really effectively plays with this duality to lay bare the hypocrisy of the moment. And I think that that's why it's really significant for her. And it's honestly one of the first stops on her journey, but it had been going on right before that. So I said 1960 is actually her second Olympic game. She goes in 1956, right? She gets a bronze medal. She goes in 1956. And that trip to Melbourne in 1956 is her first trip out of the country. And she talks about how transformative it was to one, fuel up the airplane in Guam and see other melanated people who weren't speaking English and to like have her mind and her world start to expand. But then B, to fuel up in Hawaii, to feel like you're in the land of paradise, to have palm trees and feel like you're in this whole different space. And this is right before Hawaiian statehood, right? Um, but still be walking down the street and have an interaction with a white woman that's like forcing you to get off the sidewalk. Where she saw both the expansiveness of the African diaspora and the expansiveness of anti-Blackness globally. And those at, 15 was a really formative experience on her way to her first Olympic Games. So she had already started to think about that as she rode in the airplane for the first time, as she went to a global competition, as she was doing these things. She talks about even going to a meet from Nashville down to Tuskegee, which is her first time leaving Tennessee, and watching like all of this activity and cosmopolitan life in Tuskegee was mind blowing for her. And so she had already started to be shaped by her movement around the country and around the world by the time we get to 1960. And even from then on, right, she's going to continue in that vein, to grow her activism, to be very clear about her rhetoric and her position within global politics.
Yeah, it was interesting seeing that uh, how her global experiences shaped her perspective, and then also the connections that she made in these stops, right? That oh, over here, yeah, I'm getting some favorable treatment, but I also see some of the racial disparities that exist in these other countries.
For sure.
Right. Definitely noticed that also. I'm wondering if you have had some similar experiences in terms of being able to travel and outside of the United States, and how, if so, how that has informed your perspective, and if you have any parallels with Wilma's experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I've been um, very, very shaped and molded by Black diaspora studies, by both my travels and then just working with colleagues globally. I work with like global athletes as well. And I think those things have really profoundly shaped the way I think through things and the way I think about um, not just domestic politics, but global politics as well. I think, in my own travels, much like Wilma, where you see solidarities, where you see continuities. I was just in March in, where was I? Spain, and had a really great time doing an Afro-Iberian tour with a homie in Madrid that does tours that we might do here, which walks around and shows you how everything was made really by transatlantic slavery. It was everything,
Mm,
the money from the slave trade that built up parts of the city, how that history has been hidden. We can have a lot of similar conversations, right? That I really enjoyed having in Barcelona on that trip later, we experience racism that you're like, yes, okay, like we're this
mm,
is this is a continuity, right? I right now have a number of German students in my class visiting for the summer, and we talk a lot about comparisons between Germany, South Africa, and the United States in terms of reconciliation. And what I mean by that is the way Germany has reconciled its history of the Holocaust very publicly, the way South Africa has done that with apartheid, and the way the United States refuses to do that
mm.
with slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, etc.
Anything.
Anything, and what a contrast that looks like, right, and feels like. And so, though I think my perspective of that has been profoundly shaped by working with scholars, athletes, and activists from other countries. And also, one of the last parts of my book is in Hawaii. And so for me, looking at Black athletes in Hawaii really requires this kind of what I like to call mess. I'm sure there's fancy academic words for it, but I prefer mess. I like messy history without clear answers, where there's not, it's not black or white. It's more like a gray Caleb Gale, who's the author, writes about like a vibrant gray, and I like that, right? Like this, we can be in the mess, but it can be beautiful. And in Hawaii, it's certainly the case because at one part, Black athletes that I studied in Hawaii absolutely experienced anti-Blackness and racism. And when I was in Hawaii, I absolutely experienced that. And then at the same time, um, many Black Americans who are in Hawaii are there in the military as the face of empire to Native Hawaiians who've had their lands dispossessed, right? And who are dealing with the
Wow.
might empire like the United States. And so playing with that duality, both in my historical work and then my own presence when I'm there, right? I think requires that kind of messiness and requires that kind of curiosity and that ability to think about, okay, where are the solidarities here, right? And where are the times where you're implicated in things? You know, I work for institutions that fund telescopes on sacred lands in Hawaii, right?
Mm.
Um, I think about that a lot. I think about the portion of my family in Puerto Rico and the way that there's a lot of similarities between Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And then you think about even at the Olympic Games now, I know that for a lot of people it's really fun, especially track started. So a lot of the sprint events are like just a celebration of the diaspora. Everybody's Black, they're from the Netherlands, they're from
Yeah,
Japan,
facts.
everybody's Black. Uh,
Everybody, people like, oh snap, y'all got Black people too?
Exactly, exactly. And like, you know, the Olympics is good for this. World Cup Olympics, right? It's when every country loves its products of colonialism and immigration. It's like, oh
Right.
my gosh, right? But I do
Yeah,
think
you're the greatest.
exactly. But 3 years ago at the Tokyo Games, I did a really great podcast. I had a few colleagues on to talk about the tensions of diaspora at the games and how what it means to root for everybody Black. And then what it also means, when you're doing that to realize the implications of like, yeah, the all Black team from Japan or the Netherlands like have their own experiences in their country, but also, we saw Botswana, win the gold in the men's too. That's the first African medal. That's wild,
Right.
right? Like when you think about stuff like that.
Wild.
Kalia Namor won gold in gymnastics, and she had switched her federation to Algeria, so she brought the first African medal on bars in gymnastics, right? So you think about that, and you get your first all Black podium with Rebecca Andrade and Simone and Jordan. And American Prodigies is a historical long form audio storytelling of the history of Black girls in gymnastics, right? And so for me, those moments are really significant because you see stuff like the solidarities on the medal stands together and the way that for them that's like Black girls up everywhere, it's really significant. And then also, right, the infrastructure impact in Brazil, requires us to reckon with what that legacy looks like for Rebecca. Like, so where are the points of similarities? We know that the transatlantic slave trade made stops in Brazil, made stops in the Caribbean, made stops in the US. So we're talking about a boat stop difference. And
Mm.
yet, as we've developed, then, you think about all these big T's differences between Jamaica and the United States. There's real history and complexity there, even if we get really hyped about the solidarities. And I think being able to do both actually is what really opens us up to new possibilities. Because once we're athletes I study historically have done just that, right? I studied protests in 1968, where the Cuban team, who's an all Black Cuban team on the men's and women's side, also dedicates their medals to John and Tommy after their medal stand protest, right? Also dedicates their medals to Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement, right? The women's 4x1 for Cuba does that. So there's histories and legacies that we can work with to think about this, but it requires us to get messy in a way that I find personally inspiring and beautiful.
Well, you must have a whole lot of new content for your podcast.
Yeah. Luckily, we're on a break right now because everybody has too much going on. But Olympic year is always, I'm exhausted. Every time we're in an Olympic year, I'm just like, oh, hold on.
Oh, that's awesome. That's dope. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. All right, let's get ready to wrap this up.
Yeah.
If you had the opportunity to have lunch with anybody dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Here's the problem. This is always supposed to be a simple question. It's literally the hardest question for me because I never know. I literally never know. Part of it is because
I'll be stressing people out with this question.
I like it literally every time you have to play this in icebreaker, I'm like, I'm out. I can't do it. I can't do it. And I think probably part of it is because like I like dinner parties, right? Like we need at least enough people to play spades. We need at least like a full table. I can't always think of one person. And then I'm like, I don't know.
Well, who's at your space table?
Okay, cool, cool, cool. I'm gonna do this Olympic version. We're talking about Wilma, so I would say Wilma.
Ha-
Wilma
have to, have to. You'd be violating if you didn't.
exactly. And Wilma, for me, I did my first research project on Black women when I was in first grade. I had my only Black woman teacher in my entire educational career before college. And she gave us a book called I Dream a World, and we were assigned people in it to research. And I had Althea Gibson, which was chill, but also I really wanted Wilma Rudolph. So I like tried to trade with my friend. It didn't work. But from that point on, I felt really connected to her. And just the next years when she passed away.
Wow.
And so I felt like really personally affected by that. And over the course of my career, I've had the pleasure of sitting with Coach at Temple before he passed away, which is Wilma's coach. I work with Wyoming Tyus, who is another Tiger Bell. A lot of people who ran with Wilma and who have their own storied legacies and things like that. But I have to put Wilma. I even be her spades partner. Um, I say I would also want. Ooh, see, I'm looking directly at my Faith Ringgold print, and she just became an ancestor. And I just feel like the stories she tells in her quilts and her books alone makes me feel like she would be like the best storyteller to be at a table with. So I'm gonna put her in it.
Okay, you got
Um,
two.
and then I kind of want to go Flojo, but partially because her and Wilma had a really fun relationship, and I think that they would get on and have hijinks and laughs and stuff like that. That
Yeah,
would be
Flo, you
cool to,
gotta have Flojo.
yeah. So I think that would be I think that might be a pretty good space table.
That's a lineup. That's a lineup right there. But what's a message of encouragement that you want to offer our audience?
Yeah, I also don't know if I'm great at this, this question, but I would say it sometimes it can be hard, right? Mercury's in retrograde right now. If you're feeling like a lot of things are coming down, that can be true. But I would say to keep on metaphor of go Wilma go and of thinking about races, I would say run your own race. I think comparison is the thief of joy. I think it can be really easy to look to the left or right to you, look behind you, watch who's coming, right? And start doubting yourself or talking down on yourself or thinking you're doing things out of step, but what's for you is for you. And I think about this a lot, whether it's in terms of your educational attainment, your political development, in terms of like where you are in your occupational journey, friendships, romantic life, whatever it is. I think that we live in an age with social media where we're constantly taking in images of others, right? Here's somebody else's story and somebody else's now gold medal, and this person got this and this person got that. And it can be really, it can be paralyzing in many ways. And
Mm.
so I would say the biggest thing is to run your own race, set your own pace, like in terms of that, find out who your pacers are, like who's your community, who's cheering for you, who has the water for you during your water breaks when you need it. Pause when you need to, rest when you need to. But stay in the race and stay on track and do it, at your own speed.
Folks that are interested in reading Go Wilma Go, maybe they want to get it in their schools, maybe they want to get in their local libraries. Where can they access your book?
Anywhere you get your books, it's from Bloomsbury Children's, so it's on the big websites, but I always encourage people to check out their local bookstores. We have a great one here in Austin called Book People. We also have a Black-owned bookstore here in Austin, Black Pearl Books, which I love. So find your local bookstores. You can order it through there. You can also, of course, if you want it really fast, you know where to shop. If you want things the next day. So that's where you can find it for sure. And
How
there's,
about
if
you?
you,
Where can they find you?
yeah, uh, on Twitter or whatever it's called now, it's at Mira Rose, MiraRose 88. Because I'm a really basic millennial. And on IG, it's basically the same. It's Mira Rose 06. And on my IG, you'll find a link to my link tree, which includes my website, AmiraRoseDavis.com. It has all my social media handles. It's a link to my podcast page if you want to listen to American Prodigies, which is a history of Black girls in gymnastics. The first episode is really lit. It starts a conversation with Jordan Childs. It goes all the way through looking at Black girls do gymnastics and the FISC program. So it's 9 episodes. It got you covered over there. Also, you can check out my IG highlights for behind the scenes of Paris 2024. I just got back to the States a few days ago. So I have the first week and a half of the Olympics behind the scenes covered for you there. So those are the places you can find me and any future work as well.
Dope, dope, dope. Hey, folks, Amira Rose Davis, the doctor and co-author of Go, Wilma, Go. Wonderful story, beautifully written, engages with the complexity that we deal with in our society, no shying away from the tough topics, and yet is something that our children need. So put it in the hands of our children, read it to your children. Don't let the move of resistance stop you from sharing the stories that we need to share and supporting the authors that are amplifying stories such as Wilma's story. Thank you for doing that. Shout out to Michael G. Long and best wishes with your upcoming project, Can't Eat a Medal, the lives and labors of Black women athletes in the age of Jim Crow. Hey, it's been a pleasure. You've given us such great content, and I appreciate you.
Absolutely. And I just want to take a quick moment to shout out our illustrator too, Charnel Pinkney, who's a great Black woman illustrator who has brought such life and movement to this book. So if you're enjoying the illustrations, she's a really unique style. Please check her out as well.
All right, y'all. That's a wrap for us. Peace.